Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. And this is our last episode for July, the last episode in our EJ with EWB-USA series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I have. We've been through a lot. We've talked to a lot of different people, and it's been really great learning about this organization and, more importantly, learning about the environmental justice and climate resilience initiative that they have going on. I hope you all support it, donate to it, give your time to it, because I think it's a very valuable initiative they have going on. All across the world, they're doing projects and they're looking at environmental justice. They're trying to help communities be resilient against the impacts of climate change. I appreciate it. And so I'm so glad that they're doing it. And I was so glad to speak to them about how the initiative came about and how they're implementing it in their organization and how it's training and informing their volunteers as well as their communities, and how they're advocating for those communities to get what they need in terms of resources to protect themselves and to be able to continue to live in an ever-changing world. The climate continues to change, and they are trying to design and educate and help people deal with those changes. I think it's great, and we should all support it. If you're listening, support the initiative. And so for this last episode, I was able to talk to Gerard and Eric. They are both engineers. Gerard is the chief engineer, lead engineer at EWB-USA. Eric is a senior program engineer. They're both heavily involved in the technical aspects of projects. They review drawings, they review plans, they review specifications. They make sure the quality is up to par, that the standards are being met in the country and internationally, to make sure that the projects are not subpar when they deliver them. And so I got to talk to them for a good long time about their job there at EWB-USA, how this initiative is playing into their work. And I was excited to hear from them, especially because as engineers, we don't have a choice. We don't get to decide if the climate is changing, if we should think about what the issues are, because the people on the ground, the people who need the projects, are dealing with those impacts. They're not debating it. They're not arguing about it online. They're not questioning the science because they can see it in front of them. And I was glad to hear when Gerard and Eric both shared with me that that's the way they first initially conceived this initiative. That back in 2018, they did a survey of all their partners and their communities because they knew that the climate change impacts were directly affecting them, and they wanted to make sure their projects helped address those impacts and help them be resilient. And so it's just a word of encouragement for all you engineers out there. While people are debating it, while politicians are debating it, while special interests and lobbies are trying to blunt the reality and trying to change the narrative, the truth is the people know that the climate is changing. They see the weather changing in front of them. They know that the rainfall patterns are different now than they used to be. They know the hurricanes are stronger than they used to be. They know the heat is hotter than it used to be. They know all these things are happening, and they know the climate is changing. And so we don't get to just debate the issue. We have to design and build in order to ensure that the people who get those projects are adequately protected. You can't bury your head in the sand and pretend like the climate isn't changing. I'm going to just do what I've always done and things will work out fine. They won't. Engineers, listen to me very carefully. The climate is changing and your projects need to reflect that reality. We need to make sure that our work reflects what's actually happening around us and that we make adjustments and we do things differently because the climate is different. Things are changing. It's getting hotter. There's more flooding. There's more drought. There's more of all the things that climate change is bringing that we need to design and prepare for and to instruct and teach our partners, our communities, our clients all about. Because if we don't, then we're doing them a disservice and we're not leaving them prepared for what's actually happening in their communities. And so I was so glad when they talked about that, made my heart warm because I know that that's a reality that a lot of people are unwilling to accept. And while they're debating it, people are suffering and having to deal with the fallout. So I was glad to hear that Gerard and Eric, they worked hard way back years ago to think of how they can actually move toward addressing this issue of climate change in their projects, in their engineering work at EWB-USA, which then kind of led into this initiative, which they'll talk all about in the interview. So I'm not going to say any more. Without further ado, here is my interview, my conversation with Gerard Dalziel and Eric Lundborg right here on the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have two very special guests on the show today. Gerard Dalziel, did I say that right?
You said it right.
Perfect. Dalziel and Eric Lundborg, they are both with EWB-USA, talking to us about the environmental justice initiative they have going on and just more about the organization. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here.
You're most welcome. Happy to participate.
Great. No, it's no problem. Thank you for being here. And as always, before we get started, I want each of you to introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what you do, what you love doing. Obviously, we're all engineers here. So how did that happen? And then how did you find your way to EWB-USA? I would love to hear both of you share your stories. We'll start with Eric.
Yeah, so my background is civil environmental engineering. I started working as an environmental remediation consultant for about 10 years. So working across the U.S. and around the world, working on environmental remediation at different kind of facilities and sites. And I was a volunteer with EWB for the Denver Pro chapter back in the early days of that, and then was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone. After that experience, I kind of felt like I had a bit of qualification to come in and be useful to the organization here. So I've been on staff for about 7 years, working on the international side. Most of my projects are East and West Africa.
Nice. What about you, Gerard?
Yeah, I got my degree in civil engineering, specialized in water resources, and had a kind of a odd path to EWB. Just working stiff, for 20 years and got burned out. I went to India, northern India, to Dharamsala, which is the seat of the Tibetan government in exile, and I was a volunteer road engineer and then a very bad English as a second language teacher for about 6 months when I was in India. Came back, needed the money, got back to work, and then worked and got kind of into corporate America, into a big firm, giant engineering firm, didn't like it. And took a second sabbatical, went to the Philippines and just started building homes after Typhoon Haiyan. Digging holes, bending rebar, pouring concrete. And then as I was sitting in the airport in the Philippines, I got an email from EWB, from the volunteer coordinator at EWB, saying they needed a volunteer engineer to go to Sierra Leone to work in hospitals during the Ebola epidemic. And so, and Eric, I almost crossed paths with Eric there. He had to evacuate because of the Ebola epidemic, he and his wife. So got there, worked in hospitals. I was there for 7 months and came back and kind of the same story as Eric, just couldn't go back to what I'd done before, needed to make more of a difference on the ground. Moved back to Denver and then got this job. Been here for about 7 years and program engineer, the lead engineer, and that's kind of my story.
Wow. These are intense stories. So a lot of disaster relief, a lot of on-the-ground engineering work with people who are in need. It's the kind of stuff that I love to hear about. So now you're at EWB-USA. Tell me about your role there, what your specific responsibilities are, what kind of your life is day to day, week to week, month to month. I know I look on the website, it says Gerard, chief engineer. So it makes me think that you're pretty high up there when it comes to, how things go. And then I look at Eric's profile that says senior program engineer, which gives me the impression that there's some juniors under there that you're managing and you're trying to work a program and make sure it functions the way it needs to. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just me with my consulting brain reading titles. Could you help us understand more of what your job would be and what you're responsible for at EWB-USA? And we can go with Gerard this time.
Sure, yeah. I mean, chief engineer, lead engineer, same thing. My major job, and I have Eric's help, I have a lot of help with this, is quality. We are currently working on building, Eric knows the number, 300 plus projects with 180, 200 chapters. And we have to make sure that those products, whether it be a report, whether it be a pump, a pipe, a tank, are all high quality, that they serve the community. They're effective and high quality, that they serve. And that's kind of my main job, is to bring in protocols, get the right reviews, get the right reviewer on the right reviews, and just deliver quality to all our partners, whether the partners are here in the United States or the partners are in any one of the 34 countries where we work. I also do program engineer, just like Eric. I am the program engineer for Bolivia, and I review reports, check calcs, look at drawings, the day-to-day work. And then a third thing that I do is I work on communications. We believe that we are doing some very good work across the world, and we want people to know that. We want people to get involved with that. We want volunteers. We need volunteers. And so that's kind of a third leg, of what I do: quality, program engineer, and then communications.
Great. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, so like Gerard said, I'm a program engineer. So basically what a program engineer is someone that it's a staff member that is the kind of representative of the staff side of the organization to the volunteer team that's working with the community to deliver a project. So like Gerard said, we have 390 projects around the world, and each of those we want to come in with high quality, and we have 195 chapters that are working on those. So you can imagine that we want to, check on the quality of the submittals, check on that the community's getting involved, that the assessment of the needs is happening right, that we're learning our lessons and monitoring our project impacts around the world and learning from the lessons. All those teams can't necessarily talk to each other, but we want to make sure that what one team is learning in a place is getting transferred to the next team, so we just get better over time. So yeah, that's a lot of what our role is. So it's best practices, it's reviews, it's communication, and I do a lot of the work on the data side too, with the monitoring and evaluation, just tracking our projects.
Okay, this is hardcore engineering work that you're doing. This is not just managing people and staffing and numbers. Like, we're looking at drawings, we're actually reviewing documentation of potential infrastructure that's going to be built and used by these communities. Gerard, you said something earlier I wanted to kind of follow up on. You said that you're a program manager for Bolivia. So when I look at program engineering at EWB, is it broken up? Are the programs by country or are they by region? How is the program set up?
Sure. I'll start. Eric can chime in. I'm a program engineer for Bolivia. And so the way we divide up our responsibilities is by country, because a country will have certain design practices, certain engineering standards. And over time, as you look at projects within that country, you become familiar with that and the sources of data and the types of problems you see. You can imagine that the type of problems that you see in Bolivia with the mountains are completely different than what you're going to see in Kenya, which is relatively flat, except for the Rift Valley. So we focus on specific countries. I've got the one, Bolivia. Eric has what we would call a region. I'm going to ask him to jump in. He used to be in charge of East Africa, where he had Kenya, Tanzania, a number of different countries. Most of his countries are in Africa. I'm going to pass it off to Eric to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think, programmatic wise, we have kind of a couple ways we deliver projects. Internationally, we kind of deliver projects different than we deliver in the US, for a number of reasons. And then we have programs that are done by, our offices, which are kind of well established partners that we work with that are locally registered. So, for instance, in East Africa, we work with what we call the Uganda office or the Uganda regional office. So, there's an organization registered as EWB East Africa located in Kampala. And they now take on that role of program engineer for Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, which were a few of the countries we had worked with before. So it's really great to get the local engineering staff involved, working with teams, and they can have a lot more presence on the ground as they develop projects, and including projects with the Ministry of Environment. There, we just rewrote the solar water, or they just rewrote the solar water standards, so the guidance documents for all engineers that are designing solar water pumping in Uganda. So there's a lot of opportunities when you have engineers on the ground. So I think those are our three main ways that I would say we deliver projects. Is through those local partners. They develop and manage them, volunteers internationally and volunteers domestic.
Okay, perfect. And this is just me thinking as a consulting engineer in the US now. I know obviously we have very strict standards, very strict kind of governing agencies that monitor, and you have to have permits to build things, and you have operating permits to operate things. I mean, you know how the whole thing goes as consultants. Is it similar in some of these other countries in these programs? Are there standards, or is there an international standard, or how is that governed when it comes to actually providing new infrastructure into other countries? I know for someone like me, I couldn't go and just design something for another country. I'm not licensed there. I'm not recognized there as anything important. How does EWB, and I guess you all as program engineers, how does that get managed and how does that get delivered to meet the appropriate standards for wherever you're working in?
Yeah. So, like, depending on the project type, you can imagine there's different standards. So, like, if you're doing a cook stove in like a school facility, there's not necessarily full code requirements that you need to meet to put a stove in place. Same with like agricultural projects tend to have less regulatory requirements as far as what's there. But we will always research those. Usually, you're working with a local district engineer within the country, so someone within the government there that's going to be potentially signed on to the partnership agreement, or maybe the main partner on the project in some cases. So that local engineer may sign off on the final design. You may hire an additional engineer, or you may just not be required to sign off on it. But we definitely want to advocate for the engineering profession and the professionalization of that and the registration of engineers around the world. I think it's really important for public safety, and a lot of this environmental justice stuff comes out of just having good rules and regulations in place to protect people, and we want to definitely make sure we're following those requirements anywhere we're working. I think it's one of the things we're getting better with as we professionalize and work with. Now almost 70% of our projects are located in a place where we have one of these offices on the ground that can better liaison with the government and the local municipalities or departments.
All of our offices have locally registered civil engineers, in-country registered civil engineers. And so they check, and that civil engineer is the program engineer for that country. So they're doing the review. Obviously, since they're a civil engineer in that country, they know the regs, they know the requirements, and they're checking those plans against the local requirements. Kind of an answer to your second question is, if there is no local requirement, then we look for an international standard, whether that be a World Health Organization, some other internationally known, recognized standard. And if there's no international standard for a given project, then we will use a U.S. standard and design by a U.S. standard. But most of the countries where we work do have certified, codified standards by which they want their projects built.
Okay, that's definitely good to know. I always wonder about that. And I know we have conversations just at my university and the different places about the quality of work that organizations provide to communities throughout the world, especially in the developing world. And, this idea that something is better than nothing, or at least they have blank or blank. And so it sounds like from this conversation, a lot of quality is sacrificed just to get something delivered. So I'm excited to hear that EWB actually doesn't do it that way. Like they actually follow guidelines, follow regs in a way that would be acceptable to us here in the United States, because I think that's the quality that everybody should have. Not
Right.
just a water source, but a clean one. And not just this, but something that we would all be comfortable and confident using and handing over to somebody else. And so I'm excited about that. And I'm glad that y'all do it that way.
All of our teams are led by a U.S. registered, all our volunteer teams are led by a U.S. registered engineer that's registered in the discipline, is practiced minimum for 5 years, usually much more than that, practiced in the discipline, a water engineer, a sanitation engineer, a structural engineer that has practiced in that discipline. And that just like here in the United States, they're required to sign off on the drawings, sign off on the calcs. Engineer of record, we call it the responsible engineer in charge. So we have a check here, and we have a check in country where we have the country offices and major country partners.
Very cool. So just to follow up on that point, so now we're talking about the organization itself. So how big is EWB-USA? Like chapters, volunteers? You said you needed more, so you don't have enough, but how many do you have? And how many professional engineers do you think roughly support the work that's being done by EWB-USA?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have both student and professional chapters, and so a lot of the times in the professional chapters you'll have multiple registered engineers in different disciplines and retired engineers that are involved in either mentoring the student chapters or involved in the professional chapters. With any volunteer organization, the level of your involvement kind of is always on a spectrum. We have volunteers that basically are working a full-time job, that are retired, kind of working on EWB almost full-time, that really enjoy that level of involvement. And we have people that, kind of come to meetings and support and help fundraise and kind of get the message out at those chapters and kind of work on, accounting and social media and all the different things that need to be done logistically to deliver projects. So there's a big spectrum. If you go to the highest level of the lightest level involvement, we go around 14,000 is the number of people that are registered in our system as volunteers. That number could be larger for people that maybe part of a chapter and don't register with an account. And then we say that about 3,800 are the number of volunteers that are actively working as a part of a team, as a regular contributor, working usually 2 hours a week kind of thing. So there's a big group of volunteers out there, and then we have a big group of registered engineers as a part of those. There's always one. We look. We think it's better to have 2 or more assigned to each project of the registered or qualified mentors to that team. So, probably around 1,000.
Think about that. We have 390 projects, like Eric said, and 3,800 really active, very active volunteers. And so that's about a project team, about 10 people per project team. And that's what we found it really takes to put out a good project. You got to spread the work out. You got to have your quality control check. You may have 2 or 3 different disciplines. You may have a tank on a stand. You need a structural engineer for the tank. You need a hydraulic engineer for the pump and the pipes. And so a team of about 10 is a good number. That makes sure nobody gets overburdened and you can produce that quality project.
Okay. And so you mentioned earlier that you're looking for more volunteers. Is that because there are projects that you want to be able to do that you don't have the team to do? Or do you feel like some of the teams are getting stretched and you need more support to kind of do what's existing? Like, how would you characterize the current state of EWB and what you need?
So 2/3 of our chapters are volunteer chapters, and the students, as intelligent as they are and as amazingly energetic as they are, they graduate and they get out into the real world and make the big bucks. So they were constantly in a recruiting mode at student chapters, and we're constantly in a training mode. And that's a big part of both Eric and my job, is training on how to deliver quality projects to communities. And so that's one need that we usually have. And the chapters themselves are in charge of recruiting, but we try to give them as much aid as they can. The second is in the professional side, life changes. People retire, people have children, people get married. And so there is a constant turnover, less so in the professional chapters than in our student chapters. But we are always looking for those really passionate engineers and logistics people, communications people, fundraisers, writers, artists that are passionate about this work and that can get in and make a project team better. It's not like it's a static 3,800. It's in motion. It's constantly in motion.
Interesting. I had a conversation with Scott Greger, and he was explaining to me how the application process works for communities to get a project and how to get signed off on it and how it's assigned to a chapter. Do you feel like there's a lot sitting on the table that you'd like to get involved in and do more of, but there's not enough staffing support to do that? Or do you feel like the kind of flow that you have and what you have going on now is what you would like to see?
There's always more work. We'll all retire and they still won't have made a dent in the work that needs to be done to try to raise the well-being of our partner communities. Mm-hmm. And so, in a volunteer organization, volunteer manpower is one limitation, and then financial resources. Our chapters raise their own money to build, to construct, the construction dollars and their travel dollars. So we're always resource limited in our size. We maintain good quality at the level we're at, but we could do more. We have unassigned applications that are sitting there that wait for months before we can get a team on them. Eric knows more about that than I do.
So what do you think, Eric? Do you like how things are? Are there some things you want to kind of get more involved in? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that I think one of the things of the shifts in the organization that we've been seeing over the last, 5 years has been to kind of really start to, there's need everywhere in the world, but that doesn't mean that we're, perfectly positioned to meet the need everywhere. So I think we've done a lot of regionalized focus, working with stronger local liaisons, and I think now looking at kind of better ways to pipeline and train volunteers for the role they're in. So I think I think it's a focus on quality, narrowing in on the work, building local connections. I think there's definitely room to grow. I think, like Gerard said, a lot of times fundraising is the limiting factor, and I think we're exploring a lot of things now for how to grow that fundraising in new and exciting ways to kind of really kind of start to leverage the volunteers and let the volunteer capacity be the limiting factor. Would be a good place to be.
Yeah, I would imagine. And thinking about fundraising and initiatives and things like that, it's a perfect segue into the environmental justice and climate resilience initiative that EWB-USA is doing right now. And I guess before I even get into all the details, how is that going and what's your involvement with that, if there's any at all? I don't know if you're a part of that initiative, raising money or awareness around those issues, or if you're kind of just focused on what you're doing and there's other elements of the organization that actually deal with that directly.
Back in 2018, Eric and I, as a couple of the more longer-term employees, realized that we needed to start looking at climate resiliency into building climate resiliency into our projects. We started coming up with a series of steps, really a decision tree as to how to build and whether to build climate resiliency into your project. If the climate's not changing in the world, in the particular part of the world where you are, then it's not a consideration. It could be changing a lot, and then it is a consideration. So we built a protocol around that back in 2018. It went live in 2019. Chapters have been using it. They're all required to at least look at the potential change of climate in their area, in their specific project location, see if it's a factor. If it is a factor, design for it. Actually adjust your design parameters, your rainfall, your inches per hour around a changed future climate. 2018 comes around, COVID hits. We're just trying to keep the organization together, but start coming out of COVID, and we realized that needed updating. And so we started working on a protocol looking at websites, looking at more intuitive ways to visualize the data, looking at more specific guidance so the results in a given design exercise would be reproducible. But then we realized if you're looking at all the numbers on the websites, rain, inches per hour, what does that really say? And this, I think, is the heart of your question. What does that really say about the impact to the actual people living in that community? What is their lived experience? And we had to go out and ask. And so we went, we sent members of our team plus members of our major partners, our country offices, into the countries, into former places where we had former projects, where we have current projects, and asked them about the climate. Eric went back to Sierra Leone. He got to see some of his friends from when he was in the Peace Corps and talked to them about the climate and has it changed and how is it impacting there. And that was a major step in us understanding the true impact of climate. And so that's what we were doing all 2022. And we're now translating that anecdotal qualitative data into this more rigorous methodology that I kind of introed a little bit. The other thing is we are talking about climate with everybody. And we're trying to, as far as Eric and I are primarily technical people, but we both do communication, raise awareness of climate, raise awareness with our chapters and our volunteers about climate, and raise and talk to our communities about climate and the what and the why climate is changing. They feel the impact, but sometimes they don't understand the reason. And so that's kind of the broad picture of what we're doing. We're revamping our technical work, we're communicating, and we're training.
That's perfect. So let's get a little more specific then. So now that you've talked about how directly and deliberately you're trying to ensure that you're incorporating climate resilience, climate change impacts into designs of these projects, are there any particular climate change issues that might be coming up more than others? I mean, if you say the word climate change, I feel like people, depending on where you live, think about something differently that's happening to them. If it's heat, if it's flooding, if it's drought, if it's famine, if it's, it could be a whole host of things. What have you been seeing, or people that you've been working with been seeing, and what are the kind of big issues that you seem to be continually confronted with when it comes to climate change?
So yeah, I think that's one of the cool things that Gerard's working on right now. So we have a climate expert intern that's working with Gerard this year on that. And so what we're putting together is a matrix of all of our project types and all the different climate impacts you could see. So every region of the world is not going to see the same climate impacts. If you're by a coast, you're going to see different than if you're in a mountainous area. And depending on your livelihood, you might see different impacts. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is, kind of when in the more rural areas where we have projects like a lot more uncertainty around rainfall patterns, when you're going to see the early rains, when they're going to come, how intense those first storms come. And for a lot of, farmers, that really gets to their income. Like they have to know when to plant. And with the unpredictability of a few weeks or the intensity of that first storm, it can really wipe them out on when they put their seeds down. That's a big one we're seeing. I think a lot of stuff around rainfall intensity and storms coming back to back more often. So you have a little less ability to, for the ground to absorb some of that water as it comes through the first storm. And so you're getting more intense runoff, for bridges. A lot of houses that have been there for a long time are starting to go out as you have, deforestation coupled with, intense storms. So it's really varies a lot. I'd say, region to region, it's different. We have seen some areas, really struggling with groundwater recharge, with just kind of more drought. So I'd say those are probably the most heightened ones, and all of them kind of interplay with these secondary factors of, human migration to different areas, population growth, change in city patterns and all this stuff.
Right. The income quite often is one major driver of human migration. And what we heard across Central and South America was that, as Eric said, the unpredictability is adversely impacting crop income as much as 50% in some places, and some of the people that we talked about. And so the young people aren't seeing a future in that. and they're looking for a future, and they see the great United States of the North, and for sure, part of our border problem is being driven by climate change, by the fact that the agricultural income in these countries is not as stable as it used to be. You can't count on a lifetime of farming like you used to. And so you've got to try to, maybe for your family, or you're trying to, maybe have a new family that you're trying to support. And so there is income in the United States. And so we see the problem at the border.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So, wow. Because obviously the discussion about the border usually centers around violence and violent crime and political instability in certain parts of Central America and South America. But now you're saying that climate change and the way it impacts a lot of these areas is also a factor in motivating people to move and leave and to come here because the climate has pushed them out of where they're from.
Yeah, or even not necessarily to the U.S., but you might be migrating to cities. So, within countries, you're seeing greater population push into cities. A lot of that is driven by stability of income around agriculture, and I think a lot to climate change. That's what we're hearing from communities, at least, is a lot of them brought up specifically in these interviews, as you talked about challenges they're facing, is not having jobs, not having the ability to keep the youth in the community, that they keep going to cities or to other types of jobs outside of agriculture. And I think part of that is the income you can make, but there's probably other factors in there as well.
So for you working at EWB and you hear those stories and you hear that feedback, would EWB be interested in trying to engage these communities in ways that fall outside of what typical engineers would be responsible for, right? So in terms of infrastructure, you're providing that. In terms of resources, you're providing that. But now we're talking about economics, we're talking about politics, we're talking about a way of communities governed, potentially creating some of this instability. Would EWB be involved in those kind of discussions with policymakers, with decision makers in those areas?
I think that anytime you're working on infrastructure, you have to be working with the community, and you have to be working with the existing community leadership and structures. So, one of the things that we see a lot as we interview communities, retroactively thinking about the experience of going through a project with EWB after it's done, is one of the things they highlight is the feeling of being able to advocate for themselves and the needs they have. So, I think whenever you're doing engineering in the infrastructure space, you're interacting with the way technology interacts with people, and anytime you're at that boundary, there's going to be a chance to better advocate for yourself and the resources you need to get to meet the basic needs. And so, yeah, I think you're definitely, whether it's been spoken in the past or whether it's been talked about, I think we're always in that space, whether we want to or not. And I think it's how do you do that the best way to leverage local resources. I think a good example of how we're doing that is, a lot of the work in Guatemala, all of our communities, have to contribute 5% of the construction costs to the project to just kind of show that they're bought into the system and the approach. And it gets close to about how much they'll need to operate the system in a lot of cases. And we're seeing that in a lot of areas, by leveraging the local government, getting them involved, the government's putting, 25% to the construction, really showing that they're invested in the problem as well. So by better advocacy on the front end, getting everyone involved, you can really, get that buy-in, get the community to advocate for themselves and understand the processes they need to go through to get resources.
Yeah, one of the things that we're also working on, which is a little kind of closer to home for engineers, is a typical project may be a well or a school, but part of our climate initiative is to develop some adaptation techniques, not detailed techniques, but some adaptation possibilities that they can start to talk to their communities about. If you're having problems with groundwater, we'll start working on groundwater recharge, maybe some grading, maybe gutters on your roofs leading to an infiltration trench. And this is probably a year or two in the future, but we're certainly looking at training our chapters to look at the well in detail and then at the larger community about what's the impact there, and is there effective low-cost measures that they can advocate that this community can do to help themselves, to help them their issue. Less rain, well, let's get it back in the ground so that well doesn't go dry. Or too much rain, let's do some grading and keep it from eroding our mountainsides. That type of thing. So we're, as Eric said, we're involved in the advocacy and the understanding and the empowerment, but we're also looking in a more detailed look at the whole community in a holistic fashion. And we're just scratching the surface of that right now. Some of the guidance we're writing is just starting to ask our volunteers to look at ways that they can sort of embrace the whole environment of the community and work in not just drilling the well with the pump, but work on grading or work on some infiltration or work on, waste disposal, things like that. So it's sort of an expanded view of the relationship. It's not here today, it's coming.
Okay. And so would you say that this initiative, this environmental justice, climate resilience initiative, does it help you and Eric and everybody that you work with do those kinds of things that you're describing? Is that part of what it does and help you kind of move those things forward? I'm sure you've been doing it before this initiative began, but does that help with that? And does this initiative assist in other ways to help you get the work done that you're trying to do?
It does. It has mobilized some financial resources. There we have partners, and maybe that's the partnering is the key. Maybe that's the key word is it's expanding our potential for partnership around this shared issue. We just had a meeting with the Norwegian Refugee Council this morning, and they're interested in their climate, not just their footprint, but their operational sensitivity to climate factors, and they're looking to partner with us. We're working with Arconic. They've supported us financially. It's opened up our eyes, and it's opened up our vista as to what's possible and who we can work with.
Very cool. Very cool. With this initiative, obviously it's environmental justice, climate resilience. It has a very particular focus and a very particular direction. Are there any other programs or initiatives or elements that EWB is trying to kind of promote or push or trying to incorporate more into the broader mission of EWB? Is that even how EWB functions? Is it by initiative and program? I don't even know if that's the right question to ask. But I like this initiative, but how does it how do these things start to happen? I mean, this initiative is here. Will there be another initiative coming in the future to do what you're talking about? Another program kind of instituted to kind of help corral resources in a particular direction? How does that even look?
I think the way that I see it is continuous improvement. I think, engineering a well, designing a well and a pump, that's, it's how it's always been for the last 50 years. Technology hasn't really changed too much, other than maybe solar pumping and some kind of innovations there. But I think what we're always learning is how to make this process of a community advocating for itself, a better process all around from the beginning as they're thinking through the project, and there's needs assessment into implementation and long-term maintenance and sustainability. And so I think we'll see areas where we can always improve and grow as we're going through our lessons learned process. And I think this is one area where we're seeing, okay, there's definitely a need to better work on climate adaptation and better work on environmental justice, and better work on, I think some of the future ones could be how to partner and kind of grow local organizations more. I think that might be something that's coming in the future. How to better leverage local expertise, how to grow grow the local engineering sector in different areas and kind of advocate for that transfer of ownership. I think, always understanding our place in the world and kind of the lens that we're focusing on interacting with other communities and making sure that that's a equal plane. I think there's always different ways that you can grow and deepen this simple act of building something into more longer lasting sustainable projects. And I think to me that's how I see our growth going.
Good. You want to add anything?
No, he's absolutely right. I think to using the local lens, just like we did in the climate initiative, we heard from them, and then empowering them to help us build them help them build a better project. Use that local lens to guide us to do a better job, and whether it's a program or an initiative or it's just a better way of doing business, that's what we're focused on is learning and growing, continuous improvement. Eric hit it right on the nail, right on the head. Nice.
And so just to wrap up this conversation, I appreciate your time and all the time you spent explaining stuff to me because I didn't know it until you told me. I want each of you to answer this one question for me. What is one thing that you want our listeners to remember and take away from our conversation about EWB-USA and the work that it's doing? You'll get one thing.
That's a really tough question. That's just that it's important and there's need out there and that they may not be getting involved with us, but there's ways to get involved.
Eric?
I think for me, it's, when you think about engineering, it's really about human-centered design. And that comes down to just humans interacting with other humans. And I think as engineers, we love to simplify everything down to numbers. And I think, building those long-term relationships, that's what our volunteers report as the thing they get most out of it, is a connection to another human in another place and understanding perspective. And I think, that's to me what Engineers Without Borders is about. It's connecting people to each other and finding ways to work together.
Very cool. And so with that, how can we support the work that EWB is doing? I've been telling people to give to the initiative. You hit the goal. The goal's been reached and smashed. What else can we do to support this great work? Because I think it's great work too. It's great work you're doing. How can we support it?
Yeah, I think that there's always three ways is, obviously you hit the first one, donate. I think, money is always a limiting factor in what we can do and where we operate. So I think that's a good way. If you're interested in supporting those local engineers around the world, that, you can donate to that. You can donate to projects. You can donate to, young engineers that are coming up and learning how to be better engineers. So there's lots of ways to donate. If you want to volunteer, the best way I always say is get involved in a local chapter. There's a map of all of them around the country. And then with the internet and remote work, you can partner with any chapter around the country. So find a project or a chapter that you're interested in. And if you don't have the time or you don't have the money, just spread the word. If you hear someone interested, just share what we do with them and have them get involved or donate. So those are the three that I always like to say.
Yeah. The other thing is, although we call ourselves Engineers Without Borders, we're also, project managers without borders. We're also logisticians without borders. We're all communications without borders. We're also fundraisers without borders. There's a whole range of, if you think about delivering infrastructure, it's not just the engineer that gets it done. There's a big team. Like I said, at least, we try for a minimum of 10 on a project. And there's a lot of expertise involved. One of our employees, she's got a degree in philosophy, and she's wonderfully insightful as to the various aspects of infrastructure. So don't just think of it as Engineers Without Borders. It's everybody without borders that can help deliver these projects and these benefits and form these relationships that Eric just talked about.
Oh, I love that. So everybody without borders. That's good. So the E could stand for that. The E could be everybody without borders.
That's right. It could be EWB, everybody without borders. USA,
from now on, it's going to.
Yeah.
I'll give you your residuals on that one.
Yeah, there you go. You get it.
Very cool. Well, Eric and Gerard, thank you so much for speaking with me, sharing all this information, and helping us understand what you do, how important it is that you do this work, and keep it going. We're going to continue to support however we can, and we really appreciate everything you're doing. And I thank you for being on the podcast with me today. I really appreciate that.
No, it's great.
It's great to be here.
And you're one of the new partners that I spoke about. The whole, you know what I'm talking about. The initiative is drawing in more partners with a greater voice, and we can have greater impact. And that's what the beautiful thing about this is. So thank you, for taking your time to talk to us about EWB.
Yeah, so it's not a problem. It's a pleasure for me. And so I appreciate it. And with that, that is our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. We will see you next time.